about 15 seconds. Because once we go on, it still takes 5 seconds.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Pete Rivett, and I'm going to talk about vocabulary management for enterprise knowledge graphs. Elisa gave me a bit of an introduction in terms of the work where this has been happening, which is the OMG MVS capability. I'm going to be talking more about the rationale for this and the problem we're trying to solve and the issues we're trying to address with current RDF and ontology-based approaches. Am I supposed to do my own slides?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess so.
Okay.
I'm using the arrow button. You should go to the next one. There you go.
So I'm going to talk about the problems with terms in general, which is what and I'm going to, in the next slide, I'm actually going to define my own terminology, take my own medicine. And the big message I'm going to make, going to put across is that terms are contextual. So I'm going to explain what that means and why that's important. And then explain why the current approaches used by RDF and OWL and SKOS don't really meet that need of contextual terms. And then describe the new approach we're moving towards with MVF and what you can do right now. So firstly, some shared context for the presentation. So I'm talking about enterprise knowledge graphs here. So I'm not going to explain what enterprise knowledge graphs are from scratch. So I assume there's been enough presentations about that. So what I'm going to be assuming is an enterprise knowledge graph environment where there's many different data sources, there's many different things that need to be integrated, there's many different populations within an enterprise using the knowledge graph. So there's going to be a mixture of support for different communities. And then the communities are not only internal, they're external as well. That people need to deal with information from suppliers, from government, from software vendors, and whatever. And we're also assuming in an enterprise knowledge graph environment, we are making use of ontologies. So terminology I'm going to be using, so firstly is element. So element is something that you are managing the terms for. So it could be a class or property in an ontology. That's typically the case, or some other resource. This is the thing that you're naming with the terms. And the term is, by term, I mean the label, the string that you're applying to those elements. And then vocabulary, I'm using synonymously with glossary. That's basically a collection of terms. So that's my own terminology, fairly informal. So what's the problem we're trying to address here? So in a nutshell, it's that people in organizations are spending days on end just agreeing on the right term to use for an element. So typically something like use of customer. The guy from Intuit yesterday was saying that they've had lots of discussions and they're right. And I disagree with him in that I think he said at the end, like a loan is a loan. And we've spent lots of time agreeing this is the definition of loan. But I counter that and say, you do need one definition of the concept, the ontology class called loan, but you can have different people in different communities making use of their own term for it. So you don't force everyone to use the same language. You have one meaning which many people can use different terms for. So that's the thing we're trying to address, because you can't bind all these different communities to use exactly the same term. Even if you manage to get your current group of knowledge graph users to agree to one term, you've got other external people, you've got external software vendors. They're bringing in software like SAP or whatever, which you can't get rid of, and they've got their own terminology for things. You can't replace that because it's in front of everyone's faces when they're using that software. You've got supply chain partners giving you data feeds. You've got different governments, either local or national governments. They require reports and they have laws and they use their own terms. Standards bodies like OMG or W3C have terms as well, as Elisa described. And even though within your enterprise you might agree a term, then other enterprises you might acquire would potentially have their own language and terms. So what we're trying to address is allowing people to use their own language, but have a shared meaning behind it. So how are people trying to currently, or what are people currently doing with respect to terms? So I'm going to talk about a couple of widely used standards. So RDF or RDFS, and this includes OWL as well, doesn't give you a lot out of the box. You've basically got built in to a standard, you've got RDFS label, which is the property you can apply to a class or a property or whatever to say, okay, this is a string saying, what is it called? It does allow you to have many values for RDFS label. So something can have many names, but there's no way to distinguish which name to use in which context or for which purpose. The exception being, you can tag these labels with a natural language. So you can say this is an English name, and this is a French name, or even this is a British English name for a thing. So that level of flexibility is there, but not much else besides in terms of the context. And so you're pretty much, for practical purposes, stuck with one official label, and you can't say much about that label apart from this is the label, because the label itself is just a string, so it's breaking the rule about things not strings. So SKOS is a simple knowledge organization system, is another W3C standard, often used for taxonomies and vocabularies. And people, because of the paucity of RDF, people, including FIBO, for example, but Elise mentioned earlier, use some of the SKOS properties, because SKOS has got a bit more flexibility. In SKOS, you can say a pref label. So you can say, SKOS, I've got a preferred label for this class. And that's SKOS pref label is restricted to having one value per language, as opposed to RDFS label, where you can have any number of them. And you can also have many alternative labels, or alternate labels if you're in the US, that enables you to have many other synonyms for the same class. And you have one or more SKOS definitions, which is the English description of the term, as opposed to the ontology logic. So that's one step better than what RDF and OWL give you out of the box, but it still provides no context. You might have a pref label, but there's no way of saying who actually prefers it and in what context, for what purpose. And there's no, the label itself is still a string. So it still is, again, breaking the things not strings rule. You can't say things about the label itself, like who agreed it and when. Who actually prefers it, even if you're stuck with one preferred one, it's useful to know who actually preferred it and why did they agree it, and where was it derived from. So better, but still pretty limited. There's actually a very simple extension for SKOS called SKOS XL, SKOS extension for labels. This makes SKOS label a class rather than a string, so it's one step further than the pure string approach. And it redefines, there's some clever redefinition which I won't go into. We effectively redefine the SKOS and pref alt label properties to make use of this string. So this is just a little example I took from the AgroVoc ontology. So I won't go into the detail of it, but what you can see at the right there is you've got the maize with a pref label and an alt label, and those are not just strings, they're objects in their own right, and they're of type SKOS XL label. So it still doesn't give you a context. You're still saying you've got a pref label, but again, it doesn't say who prefers it and in what context. You can say a bit more about the label and what it's derived from and so on, but it's still missing the context. And although there's a number of tools out there that support SKOS, not many of them actually support SKOS XL, at least in my experience. So that's some issues with what we've currently got. Now, I'll talk more generally about the notion of context and naming and so on. So I'm sure everyone's heard this Shakespeare quote, a rose by any name would smell as sweet. Everyone might use, in general, the general community would use the term rose, but if you're a botanist or whatever, you'd use the Latin term, rosa rubiginosa. And there's obviously other different natural language variants. And then there could be other specific types of rows. So going back into philosophy and linguistics, there's a fairly well-known pattern called the Semiotic Triangle. And this refers, and semiotics is a whole area of study by itself, and it's been used not only in linguistics, but in things like film theory. Certain images or certain patterns have various meanings, like what does red mean in a movie? What do various sounds mean? So the idea is here you have something that you see, a symbol, which is typically, in our case, a name, and that names something, that term refers to something, a class or like a count or whatever. But the important thing is this is a dotted line at the bottom, and there's the thought or reference in the middle, which is the idea of context. So again, I'm pushing this idea that terms only really refer to things via some context. And I'm going to expand out what I mean by context, or what sort of context we might be interested in. But this is just to refer back, this is a well-known linguistic pattern that we're making use of. So again, the relationship between a term, the label, and its meaning is mediated by context. For example, the same term can have different meanings in different contexts. So a word like account could mean all sorts of different things. It could be a bank account, it could be a story, an account of some event. And likewise, a transaction could be a financial transaction, or if you're a technical person, it could be a database transaction. So without that context and reference to some community, then the term in itself isn't that useful. Also, the same meaning can have different terms. So in the US, what we refer to as checking account is not called that at all in the UK. Exactly the same sort of account. It's called a current account in the UK. So it's a many-to-many relationship between the thing being named, the element, and the term. And the biggest part of context, I'd argue, is the notion of community. And this is again drawn from linguistics, this idea of community. There's various variants of it within the linguistics community, such as speech community, discourse community, or community of practice. We needn't, for the purposes here, go into the nuances of that, but there's a lot of theory behind this. So natural language is part of the community, and the definition I'm using for community is really a group of people that share a set of, and this is a tuple of term plus meaning. I'll expand more on that later. So an example of a community might be Portuguese accountants. So this embeds the natural language aspect, and it also addresses their interests and their community. Now you can be as broad or as narrow as you need to, again, in terms of sharing that common set of term and meaning. So you could have subsets of Portuguese speakers, for example, Brazilian. In Brazil, I'm sure they have a different dialect of Portuguese than in Portugal itself. And it could be a narrower set of accountants. It could be cost accountants. So the idea is this is a flexible concept, and you define it for your needs. You define your specific communities. I wanted to say a bit about contrast between definition and meaning. So by definition here, I mean effectively a set of words to explain the term, to explain the meaning. So ideally, these definitions themselves, and this is what you get given in a dictionary or glossary, and this needs to be aimed at the community. So you're not giving the community just a term on its own. You say, okay, what does it mean in terms that community will understand? Because if the term is specific to the community, that the definition needs to be specific to the community, in particular because you'd expect the definition to reuse other terms. And those terms need to be meaningful to that community, otherwise you've lost the whole point. And so the definition needs to tag along with the term, if you like. So you can't necessarily have the term in isolation for a community. It needs to be a pair of term and definition. And that, again, is an issue with the SKOS XL approach. It isolates the terms from the definitions. So meaning, in contrast, is the underlying sense of the term. So that's the referent, the thing on the right in the semiotic triangle. And this is what you'd express using your ontology in OWL or in shackle or whatever. So it's a combination of that logic and some sort of neutral language. Now that ontology element, this is the thing identified, is identified by URI, as all ontologies and RDF schemas are. And that may be opaque or not. And you may choose some sort of neutral word to construct your URI, or you could just use a random number. Because, and that's, for example, someone mentioned oboe earlier. Oboe is a very rich set of ontologies in the medical space. And their ontology URIs don't use names at all. They just have fairly long, opaque integers that they use for their identifiers for their underlying meaning. And then they have a set of properties on those which constitute the logic. The point is that any word used in the ontology term doesn't really matter. It is the term itself aimed at the community that is being used to name it in a given context. Now, I'll show some examples of that later. So a vocabulary then is a grouping of terms and definitions. And it's the vocabulary that's associated with communities. So vocabulary you can sort of view as a module, a potentially reusable module of terms. So in theory, you could associate each individual term with a community, but that would get pretty unmanageable pretty quickly. So you can group your terms into vocabularies based on the communities that they're being aimed at, and also using good modularity principles of reuse. So you could have a vocabulary which has a general set of Portuguese accounting terms, and then where it differs, you could have a subset of that, an extension of that for Brazilian accounting terms. And then that effectively, in the same way our ontologies can import each other, the vocabulary would import the more general vocabulary. And the accounting vocabulary can import the more general English vocabulary that has some terms used by the general population. So another important thing, in the same way that Elisa talked about identifiers, she talked about identifiers not being inherent to an element, but an identifier referring to an element. So likewise, names and terms refer to the element rather than the term being inherent to the element, which is what you have with RDFS label or SKOS pref label. So again, it's depending on the context, you get the you apply the name depending on the context. And I'll show you some example queries of how you can pull those together. So here's some examples which might be a bit hard to read. You can obviously look at the slides later. This is showing some, this is a UML diagram showing an example which we've got in the MVS standard. So we've got some, so the key thing here is to look at the terms. So here you've got a term for account management, a term called transaction, which is in the banking vocabulary. You've got a term for credit and deposit and transaction. So here you've got one underlying meaning, which is for a transaction element, and two different terms for it. The term credit is used in the banking vocabulary, and the term deposit is used in the general English vocabulary. Because people talk about depositing money into their account. They don't generally in English talk about crediting their account, but that's what the accountant, the bankers would refer to. And likewise, you've got the notion of transaction here with a technical meaning. This is software engineers using transaction. And you've got a different, you've got the same word, transaction, used with a different meaning by of the banking vocabulary. So this shows how you can effectively construct a knowledge graph of the terms and vocabularies themselves. And on the right here, you've also got the communities, banking business community, the general population, and software engineers. I'm not going to go into this in detail. This is showing what the meta model is, which will have a corresponding ontology for the MVF specification. You've got things here you'd expect, like vocabulary entry and vocabulary and community. There's various other management things like status and so on. And MVF entry is an abstraction for the thing that you're referring to that has the ontology meaning. So prior to MVF being complete and having software that fully supports it, there's a lot you can do today, in fact, and this is just an example. It gets a bit technical. This is Sparkle I'm showing here. But given that in a knowledge graph, you can have multiple named graphs, which are effectively segments of information, which you can selectively incorporate in a query, you can get a lot of this context applied through a notion of a workspace. So here's a little Sparkle query getting the term of a definition for an element. So the element would be effectively the input, and what this is doing is getting, so this is, you could either provide a specific element as input to get its term and definition, or if you didn't provide a binding for element, this would give you all the terms and definitions in scope, like a glossary. The important thing is here is you're selectively querying vocab 1 and vocab 2, and you can put any number of vocabularies in there, and that bounds your query, and that determines which named graphs are used to supply the value for the elements. And then what we're doing here is just to get everything in an ontology, for example, we're instantiating element as a union of the IDFS classes and the IDFS properties that we have in scope. And then we're getting the vocabulary entry for these with a, so this is going in the inverse direction from the element to get the vocabulary entry for it, which is in scope. And then having got the vocabulary entry, we're getting the term and the definition. This is like providing a complete glossary or definition lookup. And this will give different results by changing the vocabularies that you're going to be querying. And likewise, this is an example of looking up an element. So starting with the term, looking up which element does this term refer to. So again, we've got the vocabularies in scope that determine the context for that term. Then we're doing the inverse of these the same properties. So effectively, we're starting from a term, going to the vocabulary entry that has the term, and then to the meaning back to the element. So this is effectively going in the other direction using the inverse of the properties. So Elise has already said a fair bit about MVF. I don't think I need to say any more because I think she covered it all, and it will eventually be openly available, and we're managing it in GitHub. We're also doing work in the Enterprise Knowledge Graph Foundation, which is a general foundation I'm on the board for. We've got a number of members, both corporate members and individual members. That is about popularizing enterprise knowledge graphs and helping people understand what it means to have a knowledge graph. And we're defining a maturity model with maturity levels and so on. So I'd encourage everyone interested in adoption of enterprise knowledge graphs to go to ekgf.org. And within the maturity model, we've got 4 pillars: one more data-oriented, one technology-oriented, one business-oriented, and one organization-oriented. Within the data pillar, we've got various best practices and exemplars for applying vocabularies. So we've got a capability definition for vocabularies. And what we're working on now is examples of different levels of maturity for vocabularies. And we're taking a fun example, which is a movie use case. So this is all being use case driven. And we're publishing, we're going to be publishing a vocabulary along the sort of lines I've been talking about at different levels of maturity. So you can see this is what a level 1 vocabulary is like, this is level 2, and so on. So do come along. We've got, you don't have to join. There's free membership for individuals. There's paid membership for corporates. you don't even need to be a member. You can just go along to this, to the EKGF site and sign up. The vocabulary stuff we're doing is on every Wednesday at noon Pacific, and you're welcome to come along and follow along. So in summary then, the current approaches people are using are pretty limited for really managing terms, because what they ignore is the important thing I've been hammering, which is terms are contextual. And there's a better approach. We're both standardizing, and there's a short-term IDF-based approach using Sparkle that you can do to use it now, even without full MVF tools. And finally, just a little plug for Capacity Post, which is a company I joined a couple of months ago. So we're a startup applying knowledge graphs in the insurance space. So we're actually going to be a user of semantic technology, providing knowledge-based insurance-focused products. And we're collaborating with other people in the insurance space, and we're also recruiting. So we're definitely interested in knowledge graph capabilities and Sparkle and so on. So you can click, either find me, I'm leaving sort of towards the end of the afternoon, try and grab me at lunch, or you can go to capacitypost.com and join our team.
All right, thank you, Pete.
I'm afraid we might be able to squeeze in one question. We have an urgent question in the room. There was a lively discussion, which you might want to check out. But we're actually, we're right down to about 1 minute. So I think rather than trying to squeeze the question in, let's just thank Pete for his talk. And right now, we're feeding you all from lunch. I'm sure that's why there's no questions. So, all right, thank you. There's one more. Time? There's one more presentation now. Oh, is there? Okay.
Yes, there's half an hour to go till lunch.
Oh, all right. Some people bring
Everybody else is- yeah, with the-